Our panelists today are Seth Koches from Bauckham Sparks Law Firm and Cindy Dodge from our MTA office. I'm Mike Selden, the Director of Member Information Services with MTA. The first maybe 30 minutes or so is going to be Seth and Cindy talking about, this getting back to work and what that looks like and creating your plan. So I think with that, I don't know that there's anything else that I have to add at this point. So I'm going to introduce Seth Koches. He is an associate attorney with Bauckham Sparks, Thall, Seeber, and Kaufman. They are the legal counsel that MTA uses for, to help with our answers and our confirmations on stuff and what we work through. Prior to joining the firm, Seth worked as an associate prosecuting attorney for 7 years in Oakland and Kalamazoo County prosecutor's offices. And his primary practice encompasses pretty much every aspect of municipal law. So he's really a focus on municipal law. So with that, I think I will turn it over to Seth. I think he's going to talk and present for about 20 minutes. I think Cindy's probably going to do maybe 10 minutes or something. So around 12:30, we'll get to the chat questions. And again, this webinar is supposed to be done right about 1 o'clock. So with that, I'll turn it over to Seth and enjoy.
All right, thank you, Mike. Welcome, everyone. I hear we have quite a crowd this morning or this afternoon for this webinar, and that's very exciting for me and for MTA. I prepared a presentation, and as Mike said, I'll be speaking for about 20 minutes, and then Cindy will take over, and then we'll get into some Q&A. As part of this presentation, I prepared a PowerPoint presentation as well as a return to work preparedness plan that MTA will be posting both documents on their website, I believe sometime after this presentation, and they'll be available to anyone really to use, and it's meant to be a guide, and hopefully it's helpful to you. So just starting through, this is my contact information. I know this webinar is only about an hour with 20 minutes of instruction or about 30 minutes of instruction. So if you do have any future questions for me, here's my contact information, my email and my office phone number. Email is probably the best way to get a hold of me if you have any questions. So as we work through the plan, this plan will just, it's going to change as we work our way through COVID-19 and as new executive orders come out from our governor's office. This plan is meant to be a guide and to be informational and purposes only. We always recommend that you work with your township attorney because every municipality is different and unique in its own ways, and your township attorney will be able to help address the specific needs of your township directly with you. As with any decisions from a township, the plan must be adopted by the township board, and we always recommend that your plan includes a workplace coordinator to oversee the administration and implementation of this plan. It should be somebody who's usually at the office when your township offices are open, whether however many days that is per week. And always be sure to appoint a backup in case if your primary becomes available for whatever reason. Also, be aware of FMLA applicability. It depends on whether or not your municipality qualifies for such coverage, but in any case, always review your personnel policies, any contracts you have with employees, or collective bargaining agreements if that's applicable, because that may impact what happens at your municipality and what rights your employees have greatly. Also, be proactive. Train and educate employees to keep themselves and others safe. Review with your employees the plans, make it available, and tailor your plan to be flexible. In other words, encourage employees to work from home and encourage them not to come to work when sick. Monitor employees and manage infections. And I say this because once people start going back to work and things open up a little bit more and restrictions are lifted, there's always that risk that infection rates are going to increase. And every municipality and really every business, everyone is going to have to figure out a way to manage the infections when that happens. Answer people's questions and discuss concerns they have. There's going to be a lot of questions that your township's going to have to answer related to COVID and related probably to their job, whether it's possible for furloughs or layoffs. Just try to be proactive, discuss as transparently as you can the issues that your municipality is facing. Also promote proper etiquette. Obviously wash your hands, covering your mouth when sneezing or coughing. The next two slides, slides 6 and 7, are summaries of Executive Order 2777, which was issued about a week ago by our governor. This is a summary of the executive orders. This is more informational, and it's something that you can read if you download the document from MTA when it becomes available. And the same thing for slide 7. With slide 7, everyone should be at this point. In other words, determining which workers are essential or which workers are critical infrastructure workers, and those employees presumably then will be able to go to work. Now we're going to move into the meat of the presentation, developing the workplace preparedness plan, COVID-19 planning. So the executive orders issued by our governor requires the township to restrict the number of workers present on a premises to no more than is strictly necessary. And here are the definitions for essential workers. There's two types: critical infrastructure workers, for example, police, fire, Department of Public Works, if you have that, water, wastewater, and water officials, and also other workers that are necessary to conduct the minimum basic operations. And again, your township right now should be at the point where those employees are already identified. Something your plan should include is the symptoms of COVID-19. You may be aware of many of these symptoms, but this is what the CDC lists as the symptoms for COVID-19, and they should be incorporated into your plan. Preventative measures. Identify how many departments you have. And I think this is going to be very important. It doesn't matter if you're a township of 800 people or a township of 50,000. You're going to have to identify your department, and every department's going to have a different level of risk, which we're going to talk about in a few minutes. Obviously, you're going to have a clerk, a treasurer, supervisor, assessor, planning, zoning. There's going to be building, ordinance enforcement, and police and fire protection services. How many employees do you have in each department? And what is the level of risk? And we're going to talk about that in slide 13. This pyramid is the Occupational Department Risk Pyramid that was released by OSHA and the DOL, classifying the various levels of risk. And this is up to you as leaders in your municipalities of determining where each department, where every employee with your municipality falls within this pyramid. And the OSHA and the DOL, they do define the various jobs that may fall in to this pyramid, and that's contained on slide 13. So very high. Doctors, healthcare workers, and possibly even paramedics. It's people who, in other words, come in direct contact with COVID-19 on a daily basis. So for high-risk employees at your municipality, there may not be as many as some of the other risk groups, but just be mindful that anyone who comes into COVID-19 can be considered very high risk. Medium ambulance workers. I think just about every municipality contracts for ambulance services. You also may have police officers who are cross-trained as public safety officers, or your fire department who is going to respond to calls for services from someone who might be receiving COVID symptoms. Medium risk. Jobs that require close contact, 6 feet or less, with other people who may be infected with COVID-19. I think of perhaps your building and zoning departments, your zoning administrators, because contract construction could go back to work now in certain circumstances. So you're looking at whether your building inspectors have to do inspections, whether they need to obtain permits, things like that. Also about your police department, the officers walking the beat on the street, they're going to come into contact with people, and it may be 6 feet or less, depending on what that call for service is. And also be mindful if your zoning departments, sometimes they may have to travel to different work sites to perform inspections. Then there's also a lower risk of jobs that don't require regular contact with people and minimum contact with the public and or coworkers. So for those, that might just be people who are at the office that are maintaining the essential functions of the township until more restrictions are lifted and we continue to work our way through COVID-19. So the Executive Order 2020-77 allows a municipality or an employer to conduct a daily entry screening protocol for workers, and you may even ask a questionnaire. Now, the preparedness plan that I created, it does include a questionnaire that you may use as a sample. You're free to add to it or to revise the questions that I prepared. But for example, you could ask questions like, have you knowingly come in contact with someone infected with COVID in the last 48 hours? Do you feel sick? Do you experience any COVID symptoms? Those are all questions that may be appropriate to ask employees or other people that are coming to your township hall. You may screen anyone, ask questions. You could use a touchless thermometer when possible. If that's not available, you could use regular touch thermometer, just disinfect. Also preventative measures. We talked about personal PPE, gloves, masks, face shields. Encourage employees to self-monitor. They may not be sick today, but be familiar with what the symptoms are, because perhaps tomorrow or the next day, they do feel some symptoms, and that's something they should be mindful of. Social distancing, 6 feet away from other people when possible. If that's not possible, then we always recommend to wear a face mask. Increased disinfecting and cleaning within your office. Obviously, if you're in an office setting, perhaps everyone has their own dedicated workspace. If it's a situation where there's common areas, make sure you could clean those dailies, or even doorknobs. That's something that everybody touches. Just be mindful to increase disinfecting and cleaning, and have those supplies, whether it be wipes, hand sanitizers, things like that, readily available. Also, work remotely if possible. It's something that that we encourage you to do. If there are ways that people can work from home, encourage them to do that. These are all preventative measures that I've addressed in the preparedness plan that you'll be able to see when it becomes available. And these are all preventative measures that we recommend that you have in your plan. So what to do? There's 2 types of situations that you should be aware of. And the plan should include a suspected COVID-19 case and what to do when you're dealing with that, or what to do when you have a confirmed COVID-19 case. A suspected COVID-19 case, this is how I defined it. It means an employee who experiences COVID-19 symptoms or was exposed to COVID-19. This is someone who didn't necessarily get a test, or there wasn't a test available for that person. An employee who experiences COVID-19 symptoms or has been exposed to an infected person, they shall notify the workplace coordinator immediely. You have to keep their name confidential, but then that workplace coordinator can inform other people of who that they may have you can inform them that they may have been come in contact with someone who is infected with COVID-19. They should also go home immediately. And the workplace coordinator shall ensure that sick employee's workspace and other areas he or she came in contact with are thoroughly disinfected and cleaned. And the question we always get is, well, if we have a suspected case, when can that person come back to work? And that's something we'll talk about in just a minute after we discuss confirmed COVID-19 cases. So the next slide discusses confirmed cases. And that means just someone who actually tested positive. They went to a testing site or to a healthcare provider, received a test, and the test was positive. They shall recommend that they inform the workplace coordinator immediately, and that they should also go home, and that the workplace coordinator will keep their name confidential, but also ascertain anyone that person came in contact with in the last 14 days at the workplace, so they can be informed that, hey, you may have been exposed to COVID-19, and be mindful to self-monitor for symptoms, or if they want to, obviously they could contact their healthcare professional for advice on that issue. And then obviously clean and make sure the infected employees' workspace, common areas, anywhere they came in contact with has been disinfected and cleaned appropriately. And of course, everyone will want to know, will one main employee who with a confirmed case of COVID-19 return to work? Sick employee returning to work. This plan adopts recommendations from the CDC regarding when an employee may return to work. And either of these strategies on this slide are acceptable pursuant to the CDC. There's symptom-based strategy and test-based. Test-based is more straightforward. They received a test and it came back negative. That's a situation where you'll know that person's no longer infected with COVID-19. Symptom-based strategy, just have the employee self-monitor, and you could see the time restraints or the timelines in there that the CDC recommends that they pass, that they be symptom-free before they're considered to return to work. And in the plan that I created, this very language is included in that plan, and that'd be something that we recommend that you do as well. Moving on, the Family First Coronavirus Response Act, known as CARES, qualified employees less than 500, eligible employees, all employees of covered employees. That's who's eligible for this. And regarding the duration of leave, that's where most of the questions that we receive come from. And I think this is fairly important here, the last 3 bullet points on the slide. So if you got 80 hours, if you're quarantined by a local, state, or federal order, or if you're experiencing and seeking a medical diagnosis. So if you're experiencing COVID symptoms and you're seeking a diagnosis, or if you're quarantined, you get 2 weeks, 80 hours at your regular rate of pay. Or if you have, you can get 2 weeks or 80 hours of leave at 2/3 rate of your regular pay, because you have to care for an individual who is subject to a quarantine from a state, local, or federal order, or you have to care for a child whose school or daycare is closed or otherwise unavailable due to COVID-19 related reasons. Now, there's an additional benefit in the CARES Act, up to an additional 10 weeks at 2/3 rate of regular pay for an employee who's been employed for at least 30 days and can't work because their child, school, or daycare provider is closed or otherwise unavailable for COVID-19 related reasons. This act, it talks about employees who are qualified for sick leave, like reasons for leave. And this is just straight from the statute that discusses why you can leave, who's entitled to leave, the reasons for leave. And those were previously discussed. Don't require a doctor's note. When reviewing correspondence from the OSHA and the DOL, we don't recommend that employees require a doctor's note excusing an employee from work for COVID-related reasons. And the reason being is just because you might be experiencing symptoms and you may have COVID-19, but the availability of a medical professional to seek treatment or actually get a diagnosis or a test may not be readily available. So that's why we're making that recommendation right now. And we always, as sort of the theme of this presentation, is to be flexible. Fair Labor Standards Act, be aware of the differences between furloughed employees and laid off employees. Generally, employers must pay for covered non-exempt employees full minimum wage and overtime. And just be mindful that if you reduce a full-time employee's salary below a certain level and they were exempt, they may lose that exemption status, and then they must be paid the federal minimum wage and overtime hours that they've worked. And Section 13 of the FFCRA puts those limitations in place for weekly pay to determine whether or not that exemption status is lost for an employee who was exempt under the FFCRA. So that concludes my portion of this presentation. And at this time, I'm going to turn it over to Cindy, who's going to present some materials to you, and then we'll take questions. And I thank you for your time, and I hope it was helpful.
Thank you, Seth. That was great. One thing I do before I get into the questions that we received ahead of time for those that presented questions to us when they registered is a lot of the hyperlinks to the actual documents that Seth was presenting there in his presentation, like the CDC guidelines, how to evaluate the level of risk that a job might fall under in the OSHA guidelines. All of those things are linked in our resource, Returning to Work Planning. So if you have a hard time trying to find those on the internet or something along that lines, you can just use that resource guide and click on those hyperlinks. So I am not going to answer the questions that we got by reading each question. I've characterized those into several different categories because there were many repeat questions. So if you're looking for your question, hopefully you will hear it here, but not necessarily being reread. there were a lot of questions about handling money, especially as tax season approaches us here on July 1st, and treasurers having to handle money on a more frequent basis. Typically, you're handling money generally all the time in a township when people are paying for building permits, paying for FOIA requests, or paying for other services that you have in which they're going to be using cash. But when we think about tax collecting, we really start thinking about handling cash. So the question is, can we prohibit taking cash payments, particularly to tax collecting? Whether it's tax collecting or it's any other type of receiving money, under MCL 21.153, you cannot prohibit the acceptance of cash. You do have to receive dollar bills and all silver coin. You don't have to receive pennies, but you do have to receive cash. So just like many of the other statutes that are already on the book, if we had an executive order that said that right now we don't have to handle cash, that might be something that we would have to consider. But right now, there is nothing that prohibits us from handling cash. So you're going to be handling cash. How are you going to handle that? Safety comes first. There was a question that said, can I put it on the tax bill and say, we're not taking cash? No, you cannot do that, but you could put on the tax bill some type of note and give options. Like for your safety, you may prefer to pay by check. You may prefer to go out and pay by some of the servers out there, the gov.pay, GovPay. Don't know the exact words for that, but some of those other services, you could suggest that they use those, but you cannot prohibit using cash. We also got a question, which I thought was kind of interesting, and I hadn't really had a minute to think about it. So I'm not really 100% sure what our position is going to be on this, although I can hear Dave Williamson talking to me in the back of my head. Somebody asked, can we use cash apps? Can we use like Zelle and other Venmo and other cash apps to pay taxes or other payments in lieu of receiving cash? The problem with a lot of those types of services and or just the township wanting to pay bills online is the level of risk that you're opening the general fund to. So if you're linking the general fund or your bank account to a Zelle or a Venmo cash app, you might actually be exposing the township to a higher level of cybersecurity, where people are hacking into those types of programs and could deplete the township's cash. So if it is possible to use those, and I'm not really quite sure of the answer to that yet, we would have to get a more definitive answer to that with, maybe Seth can answer it here today, but if you are going to do that, I do know that Dave Williamson always suggests that you create some type of impress type of account or separate account where you are transferring money into it to pay money out. Well, maybe you open up a separate account that has no balance in it that people are transferring the money into. So they're not having access to the general fund where all the other money is. They're having only access to a very limited account to lower your level of risk. The other thing you need to consider if you're going to be using like GovPay or a Cash App or some other electronic service is there are also other statutes which you have to create policy and procedure. The township board needs to do that. An ACH payment, a credit card payment, policy and procedures. We have all of that information on our website with sample policies that the township board could adopt for doing that. So you can't just automatically receive money or disperse money electronically without those policies in place. The next question that we get a lot, was taking temperatures. Can we take the employees' temperatures? Seth mentioned that briefly about taking temperatures. Typically, under the Americans with Disabilities Act, that is considered a physical screening, and there are quite a few restrictions to that in normal times. However, right now, we do have some allowances for that under the ADA, as well as the CDC and the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission have said, because we have a pandemic right now, that those sections of the statute for physical screening will be lightened up, and you would be able to take an employee's temperature. Now, do you want to take an employee's temperature? I think that as Seth suggested, through your plan, if you have some specific criteria for when and how you will take temperatures, that may be a possibility. But should we just take temperatures all the time? I'm not sure that we should. That's maybe my personal opinion. But if you do decide to take temperatures, then the one thing that I think about is that we need to be medically trained in taking temperatures. There's a lot of things that affect people's temperatures. It could be medication they're taking, it could be health history, it could be age related. There are many different things that affect temperature. So having someone who is trained in taking a temperature, I think would be really important. You likely probably have your fire department, you have your EMS or EMTs who are trained in evaluating an individual when taking their temperature. So you may want to utilize those resources if you decide to take temperatures. Of course, maybe voluntarily if someone wants to take their own temperature because they're not feeling well or they're suspecting something, you may want to have those instruments available. Seth mentioned using a no-touch or a contactless whatever one where you put on your forehead or in your ear or something. I know they're still in contact, maybe one of the guns that you use to register somebody's temperature, but you may want to try to find out using some kind of device that doesn't require a lot of contact with the person. So yes, you can take temperatures. Again, should be part of your policy. And think about who you want to be taking those temperatures. The next big area of questions that we got was wearing masks, whether or not we have to require masks to be used by our employees when they come back to work or when they're out in the field working. So what we know is under the EO executive order is that the governor has stated that everyone is to wear masks when they're in an indoor a setting if they can medically tolerate wearing the mask. So to me, that's where we kind of get into this discretionary area and the gray area of, well, how do we determine if somebody is medically unable to wear a mask? So what we also know, though, is in the workplace that you need to try to keep people 6 feet apart. So we call that social distancing. I think we should just be calling it 6 feet of separation instead of social distancing, because that's becoming the new norm. So maybe masks aren't required if you're able to keep that 6 feet of separation. Maybe you are going to put up some kind of barrier between workspaces. Maybe the position is in one of those risk categories where they are going to have to wear a mask. So I guess the bottom line when it comes to determining whether or not somebody has to wear a mask is going to be individual to the situation and to your return to work plan, whether you'll be requiring masks. If we're just talking about those who are in the office who can maintain that 6 feet of separation, you may not need them to wear masks. The other thing about masks is the different styles of mask. You know, are we talking about just like the little homemade cloth mask, or are we talking about those N95 masks? You know, who will provide those masks? Certainly those things would be a lawful expenditure if the township decides that certain categories of employees do need to wear masks. You know, you can spend money on those masks, whether they're the cloth kind, the surgical kind, or the more extensive N95 style. So the public, we also got this question. Do we have to require the public to wear masks when they come into our facilities? We kind of butt up against the same question as we do with our employees. First of all, we have an executive order that says when it's medically tolerated. So we don't know with the public whether or not it's going to be medically tolerated for them or not. So, you know, that is a consideration too. So can you request them to wear masks? Can you have a sign up out front saying they must have a mask to enter? Certainly you can do that. If they come in without a mask though, I'm not sure that you can say, well, you can't come in or we're not going to help you. Again, that might be a question for Seth and or your attorney later. However, if you're concerned about the public coming in and wearing a mask or not wearing a mask, maybe the better options are to think about that 6 foot of separation. And how do we create environments in which the public can come in and do their business with the township? And I know for some townships, they already have this in place. I've been in some very large townships. It's like walking into a bank, and they already have full plexiglass setups for their treasurer's office or their clerk's office or doing business with the township. But then I've also walked into small schoolhouse townships where you walk in the front door and everybody's in the same room. Maybe they have their desk lined up around the perimeter of the building. Okay, well, so if the public normally would walk in and they would just walk right up, let's say, to the clerk's desk or the treasurer's desk, in today's world, or right now, maybe you don't want to allow that. Maybe you do need to create some kind of barrier right inside the door. Maybe you set up a table or something along that lines that they can't go any further than that. At our Rite Aid here, they have a counter. So the cashier steps up to the counter, rings all of your stuff while you're standing 6 feet away. Then when they're done ringing up the stuff, the register attendant steps back the 6 feet, and then you step up to the counter and make your payment. So I guess the reason why I'm relating that story is because I know you've all been out there in the public already. Start noticing some of the things that they're doing out there and how that may be translated into how you do business in your township. I've seen a lot of really great ideas out there. And in terms of expenses in providing this barrier in working with the public, I don't really even think that you need to go to that great of an extent. You know, there's differences between bulletproof glass versus plexiglass versus just clear plastic. At my little local grocer down here, they've just put up a sheet of clear plastic that they have secured through a framing system that likely someone in their store that knew how to have some building skills or whatever was able to build for them. So I think that there are ways that you can, instead of requiring the public to wear masks when they come in and do business with the township, you might just want to start more to think about those 6 feet of separation and how you can create those barriers. So gloves, we got some questions about wearing gloves. Again, gloves are kind of like masks. You know, there's a lot of research out there about the mask, about the gloves, how people inappropriately use them. You know, we use gloves, but we don't have masks, and we touch our face, and, you know, there's pros and cons for wearing the gloves. We did get some questions about elections, conducting elections. And I will just say right now that we really don't have the answers to that, because some of those answers will come from the Bureau as we get closer, and now that they have experienced the May election. However, I can tell you a couple of things. One, we are going to have a workshop or a webinar in July where we are going to hopefully talk both with the Bureau and also provide some tips and techniques for conducting your elections during this COVID time. So I don't want to get real deep into, you know, how we're going to secure our elections in terms of masks or temperatures or gloves, or those types of things. I will, though, also tell you that I did do a little Google or a little YouTube research on what it looks like in a precinct during COVID-19. And I did find a video out there in Korea where they have already conducted an election. And I found it quite interesting, some of the techniques that they use that would be acceptable here in the United States and here in Michigan. So you might want to start going out there and doing your own research. And of course, the Clerks Association, I'm sure, is going to have quite a few types of listserv questions batted around on there. Our own Community Connections will likely have some suggestions out there. And as we start to see what elections are going to look like a little bit more, we will bring more information to you on that in late June and or July. So one last thing about dividers and masks and gloves and employees in the workplace. You know, maybe people are already in their own office, so you're setting up protocols for, you know, trying to stay in your office as much as possible. Like Seth mentioned, you know, all of the different sanitations and hand cleaners and that kind of thing will be part of your policy. Maybe you do create some dividers right now. Again, I'm going to go back to that little one-room schoolhouse where you're all around the perimeter. Maybe you do have to build some walls right now, or some little temporary walls in between each workstation. I'm sure if you don't have someone on your township board or already in your township that can do that for you, the public will be very willing to help out with that. We got questions about restrooms. Do we have to allow the public to use our restrooms? You never have to allow the public to use your restroom. You do need to provide a restroom and potable water, so to speak, for your employees as they're there working every day, but you do not need to provide a public restroom. So if that's something that you want to close right now, you can do that. If you want to have it open on a limited basis, maybe for those people who come in who are disabled or are having some type of emergency and need to use the bathroom, you can set up protocols for how someone will use a public bathroom. But no, that is not something that you have to have during COVID or any time for the public to use. We had some questions about renting your township halls right now. That is still in a very limited capacity right now, because we know we can't have the social gatherings of more than 10 people, as well as everybody is to stay in place until at least May 28th. So that to me is a non-question right now. Might be something that we need to look at more in June, but I'm sure we're going to get more direction through those executive orders in terms of gatherings. And renting a hall likely will create some type of gathering. So then another question came up. It's kind of a looking forward question in terms of your public meetings and holding a physical meeting, whether or not you can take people's temperatures when they come to a meeting, whether you can require people to wear masks when they come to a meeting. Can we refuse people from coming to a public meeting? Absolutely not. I'm going to start with that one there. If we're off of the stay-at-home restriction and people want to come to your meeting just because they don't wear a mask, doesn't mean that you can refuse them from the meeting. Again, you're just like working in your office situation with your employees. You're going to want to look at your meeting space. You're going to want to set it up with that 6 feet of separation as best as you can. And use a lot of the same protocols that we're using with our employees returning to the workplace in a public meeting situation. So with that, those were kind of the questions that we received ahead of time. So I'm going to turn it over to Mike, or maybe Seth would like to respond a little bit to a couple of my responses, and then we'll turn it over to Mike.
Right. Thank you, Cindy. I thought you answered everything very thoroughly and well. One question that I did see come through earlier was, what's the difference between furloughs and layoffs? So I'd like to just address that very quickly. So a furlough situation is when an employee, it's usually mandatory, is told by the employer to not come to work and they're not going to get paid, but the expectation is that their job is going to be there at some point down the line. A layoff is more of a situation where there's going to be a separation of an employee-employer relationship just because there's a lack of work, and that position's no longer needed. And layoffs typically occur through no fault of the employee. It's just a reality of the situation. In either case, municipalities should be aware if an employee is furloughed or laid off, they could still file for claims through the UIA. And that's just something people should be aware of. Thank you.
Yeah. And in terms of the unemployment, in the resource guide that will be a part of this webinar afterwards, we actually do have a section in that resource guide about collecting unemployment in terms of if you're deciding to bring back somebody on a part-time basis or limited hours from what they normally would have had, and how that impacts their ability to collect unemployment. They may still be able to be working, reduced a number of hours, and collecting on unemployment depending on the situation.
Thanks, Cindy and Seth. And for those of you out watching, it looks like the questions are kind of piling up, and with about 15 minutes left, certainly we're not going to probably get to all of them. Hopefully we've answered a lot of questions already, and we'll continue to do so. But perhaps Jen or somebody out there on our team can put into the chat our emails for Cindy, myself, and Catherine in our department, and certainly any of you can email us and reach out to us, for follow-ups to any of the questions that we don't get to. But for the first question, here we'll try to get to as many as we can, and we'll try to keep the answers relatively short here in the next 15 minutes. But the first question that kind of came in that wasn't 100% hit on is, if a government wants to bring all of their employees back to the work or back to work upon reopening without staggered staffing or remote work, would that be a violation of any current rules?
No.
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 It's going to be dictated a lot by whatever the executive orders come out when they do. I imagine they're probably going to be. I think the governor's expressed something about steps in opening up the economy. So one day, we'll be at that stage. But if all restrictions are open, then they're open.
Yeah, perfect. And a lot of that will be in the plan on how you coordinate that. Another person's asking, is it okay for the supervisor to be the workplace coordinator?
Yeah, I saw that one come in, and certainly that is a possibility. But like Seth mentioned early on in his presentation, designating a COVID leader or a coordinator or a workplace coordinator, whatever title or you want to give them, that could be the supervisor, but it really is a township board decision. The township board is the employer, they're the owner and operator. These decisions are not made independently. In a charter township, we know that the supervisor and or superintendent have certain personnel responsibilities, but again, those personnel responsibilities are based on the direction of the township board. And the position of COVID leader or return to work leader, whatever name you want to give it, I don't know that that would even fall within that personnel director category, and the township board could designate who that would be.
Thanks.
And just lastly on that, real quick, the plan that I created that will be available on MTA's website does include within that plan a designation of whoever the workplace coordinator is. So following up with what Cindy said, the township board will adopt the plan. They'll also be appointing the workplace coordinator in that process.
Perfect.
And just real quick, I know we want to keep these short, but I just want to stress the importance of designating a person, because if you think about it as an employee, this issue of, do I have COVID? Am I experiencing symptoms? Is my coworker that's sitting 6 foot away from me experiencing symptoms? This isn't something that we want to broadcast. And there are also other confidentiality and noticing requirements that Seth mentioned. So having a coordinator really does give that point person, so that this isn't, the water cooler talk, let's say.
Yeah. So the next question that comes along says, are we required to pay hazard pay to water or other essential workers?
No, you're not. Again, that's an employment policy. I don't think right now there's anything out there in an executive order or otherwise that would require you to do that. It may be a good thing. It may be required through a union agreement or some other kind of policy and procedure. But certainly it's something that you might want to think about and think about going forward, because this could happen again.
And the only thing I would add to that, Cindy, is if there's an employee that's contracted or something in a personnel policy, which I think you discussed, or in a contract that discusses hazard pay, and if a pandemic is something that would require hazard pay, maybe the township should be mindful of that. But I'm not aware of any broad scope rule right now that would entitle someone to hazard.
Perfect.
Thank you.
Yeah. The next question here, and we've already kind of answered some of it, you guys have, but I think there's a little bit more to add on, is can the board decide when to open the offices to the public even after the governor okays it?
So in townships, we know that you're never required to work out of an office and to offer what I coin as a full service township, which means people can come in and do their business. However, you do have to have points of contact for the public for doing business, whether you're doing that from your home or you're doing that out of a township hall. So, you know, I do think right now that's discretionary how you're going to continue forward with that.
Right. The only thing I would add to that, if you're going to, depending on what your township's regular business hours were before this happened, if those are going to be restricted in some way, if you have a township website, you can post on there that these are our new hours until further notice, and we can be available by appointment, whether that's by telephone, Zoom, or whatever it may be. And you can make that available online or post at the township hall.
Perfect. And as I go through these, and maybe somebody's answered it as we go through, but I see somebody's asking if we have a sample plan or policy on opening the township office, and I'm pretty sure you said that, Seth, you're going to make that available after this webinar.
Right. The plan is complete. It's a COVID-19 preparedness plan, which addresses what we've been talking about today, going back to work and eventually reopening. So yeah, that will be available, Mike.
Yeah. And I see somebody commented that they've got a concern regarding, you know, what they're going to need for precincts, kind of getting into the election aspect. And, you know, it's already, you know, they can't get masks or wipes now. So if we're waiting, you know, how's that stuff going to be available? But I certainly am seeing that more and more of that is becoming available, especially to the public. Maybe not, you know, the N95 mask, but I think as we move on, they've upped production of a lot of that stuff. So masks and wipes, especially as we get closer into August, hopefully will become more readily available.
Agreed. If you don't want to wait until, you know, July to start planning for that, and which I wouldn't suggest that you do, yes, you should start thinking about that now. I mean, because when you think about it, it's really not about the election. The election concerns might be the public filtering through a precinct, but everybody there is your employee and they are working. And so everything we're addressing here today is about the employee and the employee working. So incorporating that into your election process is going to be crucial.
Yeah. And this is a good question that comes through here too. When they're talking about employees, it says all of our suggestions talk about employees, but does the reopen policy also apply to elected officials?
So elected officials and the government are an essential service, and they're essential workers or critical infrastructure workers. I mean, we have to keep the government going. Seth can weigh in on that, but we get this question all the time, daily on the phone. If a treasurer is deciding not to come into the office and collect taxes, it's still their statutory responsibility to collect taxes. So those responsibilities do not go away. But
the plan overall, your return to work plan, is that still going to include the elected officials as far as having to comply with that plan?
It could, yes.
Yeah. Another question, and you know, I don't know, this is so much, you know, back to getting back to work, but it's a question that we've received quite a bit, is can you hold an outdoor meeting with social distancing right now? So if you want to hold a meeting and say, well, we don't have room in our hall for people or whatever, can we meet outdoors, especially as the weather's getting nicer?
So the open meetings does not say things have to be held in a building. It doesn't address, it addresses the noticing for an open meeting and its place and location. However, that is nothing about it having to be held in a meeting. So I do believe they could hold it outside. You, Seth?
Well, generally, right. There's no limitations in the OMA regarding where. As far as is there a stay in place in order at the time, and when this,
Sure.
yeah, when this first started, and we had the stay at home order issued by our governor. We had situations where our clients would call our office and say, hey, we want to meet in the parking lot to discuss what, to adopt the budget, because that was a reason why a municipality could meet at that time back in March. The problem then was that although there was an exception that allowed the board to meet for that purpose because it was essential to the life of the township, there was no exemption in the executive orders that allowed the public to attend that meeting. So just the only addition I would have to what Cindy said is just be mindful of whatever your executive orders say.
Thanks. And one question that came in here, Seth, while you're kind of in the mix of talking right now, this is kind of a follow-up to what you had said earlier. When an employee is off for suspected or confirmed COVID-19, would they use their leave bank or have additional leave time to take? So I know that you mentioned, that there's 80 hours, but what if it gets beyond that?
So, okay. So this is something that we deal with. If you have, for example, if you have it today, I'm experiencing symptoms of COVID-19. I could use those 80 hours. Those 80 hours expire at the end of the year. They don't roll over into 2021, at least how things stand now. I suppose if you want to use PTO, other sick leave, vacation time, you could, but the act entitles you to those 80 hours if you have COVID symptoms and are seeking a medical diagnosis.
Perfect. Another question here that comes in, which I think is, will hit into a lot of people, is do paid on call firefighters or EMTs qualify for the benefits in the Family First Coronavirus Response Act?
For firefighters, I mean, if they're employees of the township, then I would err on the side of caution and say that they are entitled to that benefit.
So as paid on call if they can't perform the calls.
Yeah, we have gotten that question about the truly bona fide volunteers who are just making a small stipend. Do they qualify, or can you continue to pay them? Because some of them do count on those 2 or 3 or 4 monthly meetings that the fire department has. And again, those are going to be, yes, that would be lawful to continue to pay them. And that would be a decision on the township's aside. Whether or not that would qualify for the 80 hours, I do not believe that they would be considered an employee for those purposes. They are truly a volunteer, a bona fide one. The others who are on-call paid, yes, I believe it would apply to them.
Perfect. And then, this question we've gotten quite a bit, are the normal planning commission meetings considered essential? And I think right now, for the most part, I don't think that they're still essential, but certainly as we get into, with construction and things like that now being permitted, you're going to get into, if you have to approve a site plan for construction, or if you have to, approve those type of things, those are supporting what is allowed. So I think those meetings then at that time would be essentially considered essential, and you could go ahead and meet for that purpose.
Right, and Mike, to follow up with that, I think I would agree that construction in the new Executive Order 2020-77, construction was permitted. So if there's a situation where there needs to be approval for construction, then I think that could be addressed, whether that's via Zoom or whatever it may be. Something else to be mindful of if you're in a municipality that's processing gravel mines. That's just something that, whether that falls into construction, I've heard that come up recently as well in processing of those types of applications.
Yeah. Again, another question here in regards to Executive Order 2020-75. Can board members, planners, public attend a meeting in person? So certainly as an essential service, the township board is essential and can still meet in person. And that being said, you're meeting in person while the public necessarily shouldn't be attending because it's not essential for them to be there. If they do show up, you do have to accommodate. You can't prevent them from attending your meeting in person. Just kind of as we get wrapped up here, we've got like 1 minute left. So what if an employee that is seeking a medical diagnosis, I think we've already answered this a little bit, does not have a confirmed diagnosis? Can they be forced to return to work? I think that's probably no.
Under the Act, what it says is they're experiencing symptoms and seeking a medical diagnosis treatment or medical diagnosis. Whether or not they can get into the doctor, I think that's an issue some people are maybe experiencing. So I would err again on the side of caution if it's an issue that you may want to contest and speak with your township attorney. Yeah.
And so just a couple quick questions here. I know we're getting towards 1 o'clock, but there's a couple more that we'll try to hit here real quick before we do our last thoughts and wrap this up. Can a township board decide to cancel all rentals indefinitely for indoor or outdoor space regardless of executive orders regarding the number of people attending the gathering? I think certainly if it's the township board, your rentals, your hall rental stuff, depending on what kind of agreement you have with that, I think you would have the authority to do that if you so chose to do that.
Sure. Use of public places is a permissive service. It's not something that you have to offer.
Yeah, exactly. So, and this person says, we changed our monthly township meeting to an alternate later date. Do we have to publish that new date?
No, because they're likely rescheduling it as a special meeting, and special meetings have special requirements in terms of posting and noticing to other members or on the website. Maybe right now it would be prudent to put it in the newspaper so that people know what's going on, or on a front marquee, or a notice on the bulletin board or the door. A lot of kind of in wrapping up my 2 cents to say goodbye is, a common sense. Let's just take a common sense approach. Mm-hmm. We don't always need to know that we have to do something. If it makes common sense and it's lawful, maybe it's most prudent to take those strategies.
Yeah. And one last question, and I want to touch on this just because it's a question that we've received, or at least I've received a number of times before we go here, is can a township meeting be a combo of virtual and face-to-face? So certainly executive orders allowing virtual meetings now much more than ever before. But I do know that there are some townships that want to still have maybe a quorum in person and then open it up for the public to, or rest of the board to do via Zoom or something like that in order to reduce the number of people that are in attendance. So can that be done as a combination and certain requirements that they need to follow for that?
I think given the circumstances, it's something that can be examined. I would see as we continue to work through these executive orders, what they say. I would recommend, following them, obviously, because there are issues, Mike, with what we discussed. Because we even got those types of questions beforehand, before COVID-19. You'd have a board member who'd go to Florida for the winter and want to attend remotely, and there's circumstances, there's arguments on both sides. So the best advice I can give right now is to follow the executive orders. I always tend to try to interpret those more on the conservative side to limit liability. And then if that's something that you want to explore more fully, to advise that municipality to speak with their township attorney.
Yeah, perfect. And so with that, any final thoughts from you, Cindy or Seth, for our attendees here before they leave and get back on with their day?
Yeah, I'm just going to say, be flexible and create that plan.
Just to follow up with Cindy, I thought there were a lot of great a lot of great questions, and I see a lot of great participation here today. So I hope that it was helpful, and I hope that the documents that we'll provide through MTA will help you navigate your way through this. I'll be sure that Cindy and Mike receive the PowerPoint and the preparedness plan for anyone who's interested. And if you have any further questions, obviously we'll help you however we can.
Perfect.
Yeah, and just like one last other thing, I mentioned it already, we are planning an elections type of workshop webinar, however that comes together, so they can watch for that, as well as, you know, hopefully we'll get something out there about budgeting and you know, other topics that are of concern right now.
Yeah, yep, there definitely will be more of these. I want to thank again for the attendees for showing up today. I think I saw well over 300 people at one point for it. So again, thank you so much for joining, and thanks to Seth and Cindy. And on behalf of everybody who's sitting out there right now, while they can't probably do it, I will give you a round of applause for presenting to us today. So thank you for that, and thank everybody for joining. And until next time, take care and have a good one.